Hello, I have this owl painting that I'm going to be showing you the process of in these next 20 minutes. I start off with just a wet on wet wash. So I'm using a mop brush and I wet my paper, and then I just spread several different kinds of blues, basically whatever makes me happy here, a little bit of green, and I let the paint bloom and spread in the water of this wet page. Now, I'm also using a little bit of Winsor & Newton Black Indian ink, and I'm dotting that into the bottom here. There's a lot of liquid on my page. You can see my water is running as I tilt the paper up, my board up. And as I add more liquid to this, it allows the pigment particles in this Indian ink to really start to clump up and cluster and create this wonderful texture, as well as spread and bloom out into the rest of the painting, the rest of this wet on wet wash. So at first I dot in a little bit of ink. Just a few dots is all I really need. And then the rest of what you see me dotting in here is actually water. I'm just pouring a lot of liquid onto this because you need the liquid for the pigment particles to move around. Without enough liquid, they just don't move. They'll just sit on your page. Once that's all dry, now I'm looking at the page and I'm thinking, what should I paint here? Because initially when I started this, I actually had no clue what I was going to paint. This is done completely improvisationally. I just decided, okay, now that I've got this color and this texture and this fun stuff going on my paper, what do I see here? And what I decided to pull out of the shapes was this owl. I wanted to make this large tree in the background that would utilize that black Indian ink texture for the tree trunk. And I wanted to create this owl that was flying out towards the viewer along the bottom portion of the painting. So I sketched that in with pencil and then did some white gel pen to initially demarcate some of the highlights. And now I'm starting to pull out the shapes of that tree that I decided was going to be in the background. And I'm using my large mop brush again, just doing very loose, fluid strokes. I love painting like this, especially with a brush that comes to a nice point, because it allows you just to be very loose and flowy, allows you to contour these shapes in a very sensuous way, and it's just a very satisfying way of painting. So here I'm just creating the branches, creating these smaller little twiggy bits and little bits of foliage. I don't want this to be a completely dead tree. I want it to be stark but not completely bare, and some more trees in the background as well that I'm shading in just to kind of loosely define their forms. I want there to be a very dark base on this because I want it to be a silhouette. So right now I'm pushing my colors darker than I want the final to be, because also watercolors do tend to dry lighter after the pigment has a chance to settle. And you can see even that shift right there from the wet to now the dry. That blue has really taken on this wonderful glow. And once that is completely dry, I'm using white Daniel Smith watercolor ground, and I'm pulling out the negative shapes, the negative space shapes of the areas between the branches and around the branches. So you might wonder why I decide to do this route where I paint lots of large messy washes, and then rather than leaving the white of the page, I go back with the white watercolor ground. And part of that is because I actually like the look of this. I enjoy the way the white watercolor ground is not quite completely opaque, and so you get this ghost of the color and the textures and things that are happening underneath it, and it adds to this richness of the silhouette. It becomes not just the simple tree silhouette, but this sort of nebulous boundary between the branches and the negative space areas around it. And so this is a particular technique that I employ because I actually want to have this specific look rather than the avoidance of painting the light areas. I do that too in other situations, but especially in backgrounds and especially in trees and foresty type of things, I really just adore the look of what painting negative space on top of color actually looks like. Okay, so as I finish up with this negative space stuff, I'm doing these large areas in the bottom and some of those tight little branches and little bits of spaces up above. I sort of blend it out so that it's not quite a stark hard edge. I like to have a little bit of softness to the transition zones, and so that it's not quite like here's white, here's color. It's more of here's white, which kind of blends and melds with the texture of the watercolor and the texture of that black Indian ink, and gives me this more complex kind of texture to everything. And then I splashed it with gold mica paint and I let everything dry. So here's another drying phase where I wait. And once it's all dry again, then I can continue with things like glazes and painting on top of those other areas. And I wanted to get a layer of a darker tint over my white. And that's why I did that glaze of bluish tone in the above areas, and in the lower areas I'm doing a glaze of golden greenish yellows as well. And once that's all dry, here you can see what that looks like. And then I can proceed with more glazing, darkening those upper corners even more, adding more of a purpley black tone this time. I love doing these multiple layers of glazing because, again, it adds a lot of beautiful complexity to the tone, and it becomes not just a simple gradation, but this gradation that has hints of all these other tones and colors that have gone into the various layers and the various glazes that have been happening one after another. You don't have a simple just here's purple to blue to white to green, but more of a layered, complex variety of those shifts of color and tone. Now, as I shift to the owl now, I'm doing a base layer glaze of these darker colors because the light is clearly coming from the back here, and so there's going to be a lot of dark shadowed silhouette going on with this owl. Initially, I'm starting off with basically just painting the entire body in silhouette. I'm using this greenish blue tone for that as my base layer. Painting some white watercolor ground to give a bit of contrast definition to my owl, and blending that outward into the surroundings so that it's not so obvious, but I just want to have much more of a stark contrast between the dark silhouette of the owl and the surrounding areas. So there's a little bit of this nimbus of light that I'm doing with the white watercolor ground going around the silhouette. Going around the wings here really adds a lot of stark definition to that silhouette, really makes it much more of a pop so that you see those individual feathers of the wingtips. And I'm adding a little bit more white watercolor ground into the surrounding background area because of those layers that I did before, those layered glazes of different colors. My bright whites had been really pulled down into a more neutral tone, and I wanted to push that back again into super bright white, not for the entirety of the background, but just in certain little areas. So you get that feel of sunlight kind of peeping through the distant branches of the tree and kind of shining through the little gaps. And again, this is a result of layers and layers and layers. It wasn't just the single layer of the white watercolor ground on top of the background areas. It was the background and then white watercolor ground and then more background and more background in multiple colors and different layers and then a little bit of white on top of that. And so all of this sort of builds up into this beautiful depth, even in a small painting like this, much more so in larger pieces where I will sometimes go back and forth in this way for 10 layers or more. Now with the owl, I'm adding a little bit of some orange and gold and yellow colors, and this gives more of a color contrast pop by comparison again to the blues and yellows and golds and greens that consist of most of the background. And I'm using a white gel pen to really add a little bit of limming light along the edge, along the rim of the owl. And then I wanted to do this kind of smoky tendrils of, I don't know, condensation or maybe magical stuff, or just something drifting off from the back and the wings of this owl as it takes flight in this early morning light. And I did that with a white gel pen, just doing these little swirls of light there. And then I take the white watercolor ground, actually, no, sorry, this is clear watercolor ground, and I paint over that while the gel pen is still a little bit wet. And what that does is it diffuses the lines of the gel pen a little bit. So I usually wait a minute or two to let the ink set a tiny bit. And that way, because if you do it right away, if you just like do gel pen and then you do the white watercolor ground or clear watercolor ground or water, then your gel pen just immediately dissolves and you don't see any of these lines that you created. So I wait a couple minutes so that it sets just the tiniest little bit, not quite fully, but enough that everything is not pulled away or reactivated as soon as I put liquid on top of it. And I'm taking my number zero round brush here and adding a little bit of shading into those swirly bits so that it has more of this white glow look coming through with it. Moving along the back of the owl. And I'm using color tones that are neutral, but mostly in keeping with what the background consists of. So these would be the blues and the greens, muted a little bit by, Payne's gray or some brown tones, just so that it's not super bright. I don't want anything here to be a really sharp color contrast, because that's the color palette that I've established in this piece is mostly fairly muted. It's blues and greens, but not even super bright blues and greens. These are sort of dampened, and so I have a limited range of color contrasts that I can work with and explore. But I do have a lot of light and value contrasts formed by the light of that white watercolor ground in the background area and in these areas surrounding the owl. Little details of the owl painted in with the number zero round brush, the face, the eyes, the beak, the little bits of hints of feathers along the chest and wings, so that we have a hint of detail. It doesn't have to be a lot because this is a fairly small piece, but I do want a tiny bit to really draw the viewer's attention into these areas, into the focal points of my painting, which is the owl, of course. Final little details using white watercolor here, not the gel pen, because I wanted it to be a little bit lighter in tone and not quite as bright as the white gel pen is. And also because I have more fine control over tiny little bits of lines and details if I use my brush versus the pen. The pen is a little bit more blunt and less finesse to it. Some feather details here. This is mostly in shadowed area, so the viewer really doesn't get to see a ton of that detail pop, but it does add a richness to the texture of the wing to have this regardless. I'm also periodically swiping with my larger, flatter brush that blends the colors a little bit. I just have it's a little bit damp. It's not quite wet. It's not dry. There's another swipe there. But what that does is it softens all the lines and the bright contrast so that things are blended a bit more and they have a bit more of a diffuse look to it. You can see I keep going back and forth. I use the paint, I use the gel pen, and I use a lot of that softening flat damp brush swipe. And I go back and forth between these items over and over again. And over the course of so much repetition and buildup, it adds this layered texturing to everything. Some white gel pen stars, starry bits within the silhouette of a tree, which is something that I like to do frequently. It's a motif that is often found in my art, where I have these giant tree silhouettes that would be the solid item in our viewing space, but rather than have that shadowing the starlight, I usually have the stars within that area. And then I'm just softening that white glow from the gel pen a little bit by adding some diffusing effect with the white watercolor ground. And one final swipe with this bright kind of blue because I wanted a little bit more of the bluish tint to the upper areas. So this is just a glaze of these cerulean colors in the upper portion of the painting. And in the lower part of the painting, a complementary greenish swiping glaze. This just pushes the corners of the piece back a little bit so that they recede from the focal point of the owl and give the viewer something more to latch into as they first see the painting, because these background corners now are going to be pushed back and not take so much prominence. A little bit of gold speckling at the end, and there we go. We have the finished piece. Thank you so much for joining me on the journey of the creation of this owl painting.